People think I'm obsessed with this, but I'm okay with it. I am obsessed with it. And I think this is an obsession that doesn't hurt anyone.
Hey there, and welcome to part 2 of my tech tutorial. Today is going to be the more advanced video where we're going over techniques to make boards like shadows, cherries, and joes. In the video, we'll mostly be focusing on how to shape the boards, the paint jobs, and how to make the other small details. If you haven't already, I recommend going to watch part 1 for the more basics of prepping and priming the boards, the basics of paint jobs, and some things like that. The materials that we'll be using are the same from the previous video as well. As you can see, I've already sanded off the designs and started sketching on the new shape for the boards today. So now we're ready to hit the ground running. To help with the more complicated shapes, I took some reference pictures of the skateboards and put them in a Word doc to print out. I compared a piece of printer paper to the size of the Word doc to then make sure if the skateboards and the references were roughly the same size. After that, I just printed them out. Cut out the printed templates, and from there you can use them as reference on the boards to sketch out the right shapes. Using a light pencil, you can use these templates to sketch out the really complicated shape, like all the weird things on Shadow's board. The tech deck here is longer than the template, so I end up having to move it around a little bit while I trace the different parts. Using the truck placement is a good way to try and roughly get the right shape onto the board. Proportion-wise, Carla is the most difficult board to shape. I cut the template at screws so that I can shape each section independently. I then use a set of trucks with wheels to mark the board just to make sure that the finished board has the wheels visible from the sides. Next, with a white marker, I sketch those same templates on the top of the grip tape. Then I carefully carve it away with an X-Acto blade. Peeling it off afterwards is the most satisfying part. If the grip tape leaves a little bit of residue behind, Goo Gone works really well to clean it up. The board is now ready to be shaped, so it's time to grab my Dremel and a variety of different bits to get to work. Joe's board has a very round shape, which takes a lot of patience to make sure that you have the right symmetry. When working on plastic like this, the Dremel often leaves a little bit of a jagged edge, so it's important to sand that off afterwards. While I'm sanding, I use repetitive motion in a sort of curved stroke to help work on the point of the nose of the skateboard. The flex hose attachment was a bit too awkward, so here I'm just using a grinding and sanding bit with the regular hand Dremel. You can also really see here how when the plastic gets hot, it starts to clump up in those little formations. It's important to let those cool, but afterwards you can just snap them off with your fingers and then sand away any excess. Make sure to check with symmetry for the trucks and to make sure that the wheels will be visible. Now with this much smaller engraving bit, I'm really getting into the ends of the tail to make sure the little points are very sharp and small. Use some sandpaper to finish off any last imperfections, and with that, that's the end of how to shape Joe's board. Shadow's board is likely the most difficult to shape, so it's important to take it slow. Using the grinding bit, I'm working down the sides and working into the grooves for some of the small pointed parts. After that, I take the engraving bit to get into the smaller details of the little grooves and flares. I use the grinding bit further to smooth down the curves at the side. It's also really good for getting larger chunks of the plastic off at one time. Once you've got all the details carved in, finish it off with some hand sanding. While the shapes on Carla aren't too complex, they are very straight lines and very symmetrical. I'm using the grinding bit to take away larger chunks of plastic at one time, and after that I'll sand them down by hand to get them as flat and smooth as possible. Once I've made some good progress, I compare the board to the template and then make revisions as they're needed. The grinding bit really did the bulk of the work on this board, but I also did a lot of sanding by hand with 180 and 120 grit sandpaper. Now because Carla isn't your average skateboard and is really very unique and technological, it's very difficult to recreate these shapes exactly. But for this project, I decided I'd try something I've never done before, and I'd try to flatten the tech deck. And surprisingly, it worked. My filming setup is a little bit difficult, so I'm going to use some diagrams because I really couldn't get any good footage of how I flattened these boards. Starting out, my setup on my ironing board was ironing board and then a small metal tray, a silicone baking mat folded over, and on top of that was a press cloth. I realized this was blocking a little bit too much of the heat, so I switched to just having a layer of wax paper and then the press cloth on top of the board. I set my iron to a medium-low heat, and then I start pressing. There are two techniques I used to achieve flatness. The first is to place one end of the iron onto one of the ends of the board, and then slowly press it down towards the ironing board as it heats up. The second is to put the board grip tape side down, put the iron on top, and then slowly and carefully press down. Don't press too hard down on it because the heat should be enough by itself. And I hope you enjoy these top-notch diagrams. Be careful when you take it out because it still could be quite hot, but if the board still is a little bit warm, you might be able to help the shaping a little bit with your fingers as well. I'm honestly still a little bit surprised that this idea worked. But while it was being reshaped, it changed the shape of the screw holes a little bit, so that'll affect putting the trucks on. So we're going to take the same Dremel carving bit and just carefully using it to drill out the holes. Be careful not to make them too big. You just want to get rid of the little bit of excess from when the board was bent down. Last step here is to fix up some of the grip tape that got a little bit damaged during the shaping process. So peel off any of the excess, and here I'm taking a piece of the grip tape that I salvaged from Joe's board. Cut it out to fit the shape of the piece you want, and then add a little bit of Weld-Bond glue to blend it in and keep it secure. There you have it, all the boards are done shaping and are ready to be painted. I wanted to try another technique to try and keep paint out of the holes for the screws, so I put in some toothpicks, cut them down to size, and then secured them with washi tape. It seemed like a pretty good idea, and it worked okay for Shadow's board, but we'll get more into those details later. After already putting down a base coat of white, I mix up a bluey gray teal color and start putting that down in the areas where it'll be visible. And make sure to get it on the edges too, and give it about 2 coats to get the right opacity. Then I start roughly sketching out the shape for the graphic. Shadow's graphic is very complicated, so this takes quite a few steps, and I work very slowly to build up the layers of color. I start with a very thin layer of a watered down orange for the hair, and then a watered down green and yellow for the skin of the zombie. I build up the green and yellow separately at first, and then later I'll blend them together. When the first layer is dry, I start adding a second one, so I can slowly build up the opacity of the zombie. Once the shape is slowly starting to come together, I start sketching out the facial details so I can start adding more color and detail. After that, I paint some white over top, and then I add some red and black over that. Now sadly, I didn't water down some of my paint enough, so there was brush strokes I had to sand down, and that did affect the clarity of the paint, so I was looking a little bit dirty. I decided to paint them over, and then ended up redoing a lot of the details I had done. But after I had fixed those things, I was much happier with my progress, so I took my old faithful tiny little brush and started adding the very fine black details. This is by far the most difficult of all the paint jobs. For a lot of the small details like the teeth and the lettering, I start by just painting them white or whatever their base color is, and then use black to get the smaller details in over that. Fitting all the letters in really was a pain. When I'm adding these little details, I want to make sure there isn't that much paint on my brush, which is why I wipe off a lot of the paint on my hand to make sure that I have just the right amount on the brush. All the lettering in general was just the bane of my existence in this paint job. But with all those details coming together, things are starting to look pretty good. The zombie's eyes are probably one of the most grabbing part of the paint job, and they're pretty easy with just a little bit of red and white paint. When I was adding the black lines to the hair, some of them got a little bit out of hand, so I then had to go over them with a little bit more orange and a little bit more of the teal just to correct some of my mistakes. And after many hours, the graphic is finally done, so let's turn to the top of the board. I painted the main section of the board black already, and now I'm going to take some green paint to start painting the flame shapes. First I paint the rough outline of where all the flames will be, and then I go in and fill all the gaps with black. And then I just fill in the rest with green. Last step is to take some of the teal and then cover any edges that have been painted with other colors during the process. So this time around, Joe's paint job didn't exactly go as planned. Essentially, at first I was just going to recreate the method I used in my previous TikTok video. So I added a base coat, the gold paint, and the sealant, but when I went to go take the toothpicks out, it ripped up all the paint. So I decided to try a second time, this time without the toothpick method. I added my base coat and my yellow paint, and a healthy coat of sealant that I really let dry. The original method was like scratch art that I did as a kid, where you'd scratch away the black paint to reveal color underneath. Mix up black acrylic paint with water and a little bit of dish soap. And then I add a few coats of the black on top of the gold paint. I think I made a mistake in the ratio of water to soap to paint. Using one of my Dremel bits, I go to test to see if I can scratch out some of the paint, but it wasn't really working that well. But out of stubbornness, I persist and begin trying to scratch out the pattern on his board. And I really mean try, because I wasn't making any progress. I tried a lot of different types of Dremel bits and tools and needles, and still nothing was working. I was really at a loss for words. I really didn't want to start all over again, but it wasn't looking good for me. I started sanding off the paint, but then as I did I realized that I might be able to still use what I had. Using some gold mixed with yellow paint, I start sketching out some of the larger line details on the board. And then I add some of the inner details as well. Then using a black paint, I can thin down some of the gold lines and also mark off some of the scratches that were left on the sandpaper. Moving on to the middle, I start building other shapes of the graphic up. It's really hard to fit all of the details on this small scale, so I try and focus on the main important parts, like the tail and the fish's face. The black paint can also be used to add small, negative space details. And there are a lot of details to add. Overall, I spent a few good hours using the black paint to mask out other details, and then reinforcing others with more gold paint, and keeping the scratches that I used from the sandpaper to create a subtle gradient kind of effect, where it looks like very thin, small sketch details. I also found a really nice new gold paint that really catches the light. It adds a lot to the finished skateboard graphic. The finish line is in sight, so it's time to add the small scratch details. It does hurt to scuff up this paint job that I spent so much time on, but using some tweezers, I add the little bits of scuffs based on the concept art. The last step is sealant, and this is a mixture of a little bit of matte and a little bit of high gloss varnish. Now turning to the top of the board, I'm adding even more scuffs based on the concept art with my tweezers. Then taking down some watered down brown paint, I'm painting it over top of these scratches and then blotting off the excess with a paper towel. The last step is the lettering on top of his board. It took me a few tries because lettering isn't my strong suit, but taking a thin brush and acrylic paint, you just carefully add the letters over top. The S took me more than one try. But luckily, the paint removes really easily when it's not dried yet. Now just add some matte sealant over top and Joe's board is done. The first part of Carla's paint job is pretty simple. Take some watered down black acrylic paint and give it a few layers until the whole board has an opaque black paint over it. Make sure to get all the edges too. After that comes sealant. I wanted the body to have more of a shiny look, while the top grip tape I wanted it to remain matte. It took me a few different tries because I had to try a few different mixtures of sealant before I was fully happy with the finished look. But there it is. It's time to break out the box board to add some more details to the tech decks. Taking 3 pieces of cardboard, paint 1 silver, 1 gold, and 1 black to make details for each tech deck. Give each a few coats of paint, and then afterwards match the sealant that you used on the rest of the board. And with that, we're now ready to add all the extra details with these finished pieces of cardboard. Let's start with adding all the black detailing on Carla. Lay the board down on the piece of cardboard, then trace out the details you need. Cut them out to test fit them, and then trim them down more as needed. Once they're trimmed down, take a black marker or more black paint and paint the edges of the cardboard that was exposed. That way there's an entirely black edge and you don't see any cardboard seams. Glue them down. I was using the very last of my Weld Blonde glue, and then you can attach them to the board. I glued the 2 small pieces together first before I attached them both to the board together. The last detail is just a thin strip of black cardboard. I cut out a bigger chunk and then trim it down shorter as needed so I can cut down a narrow sliver of black cardboard, and then attach it and treat it the same way as you did the other pieces. And now it's time for the actual main bulk of Carla's paint job. Adding the pinkish purple lines of the detail is easier to do after you add the cardboard bits, so I hope you don't mind me putting this part of the paint job right at the very end of the video. With a thin brush and a steady hand, you want to paint these lines as delicately as possible, using reference images to guide you. It's also helpful if your board is symmetrical, because then you can use the different corners to try and make your lines even on all sides. Make sure that you're working slowly and go section by section to work in small steps at a time. If you make a line too thick or if you want to redo it, paint over it with black paint, and once that's dry, you can try again. The backside also has a few pink and silver details, so make sure to add those as well. Paint job is almost done. The last step is optional, but I enjoy taking some high gloss varnish and then running that along all of the paint lines, just to give it a nice little bit of a pop. Now moving along to the silver edge details on Shadow's board, which are pretty complicated. I traced out every edge of the board twice, because we're going to have to cut these out for the front and the back of the board. Carefully cut them out so you can do a test fitting, and then you're going to want to make sure you remember which pieces are for the front, the back, and which are for the left and the right side of the board. Once you're happy with the shape you've got, glue them down. This time I'm using Gorilla Glue. And this worked just as well as I did before with the Weld Bond. I keep a lot of my older destroyed brushes, and I use those to brush on the glue on the back of the cardboard, and that way I can then press it right onto the tech deck. You can use any glue you'd like for this. I'd recommend a liquid type of glue and something with a strong bond, as well as something that dries quickly is better. All the edge pieces are secure, take a bit of glue and a small brush and brush along the edges so they're all firmly glued down. I then take some of my art markers and draw little black dots to indicate the screws on all these metal pieces. You could also just as easily use paint for this. I trace out the areas around the trucks for Joe's board to mark where the little gold details are going to be. Getting the size and placement right for this one was a little bit of a challenge, mostly because I didn't want to obscure too much of the paint job. Like the other pieces, I attached this one with Gorilla Glue, and then press it onto the board. Now there's only one more challenging detail remaining, the wheels on Joe's board. I thought for a long time about how to make these wheels, but also just what they were in the first place. Luckily I found a thread on the Sk8 Theme Identity subreddit of people discussing the wheels, and the conclusion they came to was a thing called shark wheels. And this instantly made a lot of sense to me. I figured these would be great for the environments at S, meaning they'd be perfect for Joe to skate with them there. Now for as to how to make them, that was also another challenge to figure out. Lucky for me, I had enough green and orange wheels to experiment with for a little bit. On the outward facing side of your wheel, draw one dot in each of the 4 cardinal directions. Then extend those dots all the way down the side of the wheel, and on the inward facing side, draw another dot in between the other ones you've done before. With all the wheels prepped like this, it's time to start shaping them. I put a straight sewing pin through each wheel and then press them down into a soft eraser. My Dremel is a bit too powerful to use on a small thing like this, so I'm going to be using my pet nail grinder. This is essentially a mini, less powerful Dremel. This small grinding bit should work well on the wheels. Place the tip of the grinding bit along each of the dots on the top of the wheel, very slowly and lightly, essentially just making a small little dent at a time. Keeping the wheel in place with something like an eraser really helps get a good grip on the wheel when working with such a small, fine little detail. The goal is to slowly grind down a small dent at where each of the dots are on both sides. That way it kind of gives a waved appearance. Once you start making good progress, it gets a bit easier to take the wheel off of the eraser or whatever you've pinned it to be able to really handle it while you get those fine details in there. And you can kind of get an angle on there to really help get the right curve that you're looking for. That covers the basics for how Joe's wheels are made. Now let's move on to Shadow's wheels. He has these large rubber treads on them that almost resemble monster truck wheels. To replicate it, I'm taking this 2mm EVA foam, and I'm cutting out a strip that will go all the way around each of the wheels. Make sure they cover the entire circumference of the wheel, but also make sure they're the same width so there's no overhang. To give these strips a tire-like appearance, take an X-Acto blade and lightly score along the edge of all these strips. Don't cut too deep because you don't want to cut the piece of foam in half. You just want to make a light mark so that when they're curved around, they'll open up and it'll look like there's tire treads. Afterwards, it's time to color them dark. If you have a black colored foam, you can skip this step. You could use paint for this. I'm just using my alcohol markers like I always do. I initially tried to use hot glue to attach them. I put a line of hot glue all the way down the wheel and then an extra little dab to keep it closed. This fell off pretty quickly, so I ended up reattaching them later on with Gorilla Glue for extra strength. All the small details are done. Now it's time to assemble the boards. If If you watched part 1 of my tutorial, you probably know how to put wheels on a tech deck. It's pretty simple. All you need is the Sk8 tool that comes with most tech decks, and then the trucks, nuts, and the wheels. Attach the wheels first, then you can screw each truck into place on the board. Then I add a bit of purple to each of the screws for some last minute finishing touches on Carla. The actual last step is cleaning up the mess I made when I painted the screws. Both Joe and Shadow's boards have black trucks, but I didn't have any available to me at the time. My solution was just to color these black. You could use paint for this, you could use any kind of different lacquer or spray paint, and it's a pretty easy solution just to use alcohol markers or Sharpies. Be really careful when screwing on wheels like Shadow's. They're pretty delicate, and it was during this process that I started having some of the foam bits pop off. Screwing them to the board is just the same as it would be with any other tech deck. And you can see here me reinforcing the wheels with more Gorilla Glue just because the foam kept falling off. Joe's wheels and trucks are just normal to put on like any other tech deck. And with that, we're finally done. I love comparing the first versions I made of these decks to the second finished ones. It's really cool to see how my skills improved, mostly my work with a fine brush and work with black lines. They're all similar, but they're all also unique in little ways, and you can really see the improvements that were made. Techniques that worked the first time, like the scratch painting on Joe's board, didn't work the second time, but then I also found ways to improve it, like a better paint job, the wheels, and I also learned a lot more about how to shape these decks and new techniques to get even more screen accurate shapes. And I'm still surprised with some of the techniques I pulled out of I don't know where to make a flat board like with Carla's. It's wild seeing them all together like this and seeing how the collection grows because of all the time that went into such little tiny projects like this. And since I now have a double of every board, you might be wondering what I'm going to do with them. I'm actually planning on gifting some of these boards to the voice actors and other people who worked on the show. So if you have a P.O. box and worked on Sk8 the Infinity, you might be seeing some of these boards sometime soon. This massive video took a long time to make, so thank you very much for watching it, and thank you very much for all the support I've gotten on all these projects. And I hope you have a great day, and see you in whatever the next thing that I do is.